prepping for single people. There's different types of preppers, and I'm going to go through a variety of them. In this particular video, though, I'm just going to talk about single preppers. And other videos after this, we're going to talk about young preppers, middle-aged preppers, older preppers, and married preppers. And we're going to just kind of talk about them in general fashions, about some of the challenges and concerns, various aspects of how to become successful as a prepper in that paradigm. So when you're a single prepper, you have the total responsibility to care for yourself. So you have to satisfy all your needs, and you can't be dependent on others. You have to battle the loneliness and convert that into a type of solitude that you look forward to. And those people who are comfortable with themselves know what I mean. If you can spend a week by yourself and have very little contact with the outside world, you've transitioned from any type of loneliness to a solitude. And it can be very comfortable and very rewarding because you learn how to be yourself with yourself. And that can take a whole nother level of satisfaction, when you live your life. So you don't have to be dependent on others to meet your needs. You also have to look at the real importance of your family and friends, even your neighbors, when you're a single person and living in a single fashion, by yourself, because you start to see that your support network is very valuable. Even though you're still responsible for yourself and all your needs, it sure is nice to have a little support from time to time. You also learn how to leverage various aspects of yourself within prepping in particular, that you notice that you can't do everything. For example, you may not be able to raise a garden the size you would actually really want. Or maybe you're into animal husbandry and you want to raise 20 chickens, but you're by yourself, and maybe it's only practical to raise 5 to 10 chickens. And so you look at, these types of goals, and you have to say, okay, maybe what I'll do instead is I'll raise the chickens and my neighbor will grow the vegetables, for example. And maybe you can do a trade-off there. Prioritize your preps to your specific needs. Now, this is a big one here because you're not prepping for other people. You can actually prep with the stuff that you really, really want and don't have to have a compromise on anything. Because if it's just yourself, you can just be totally upfront from the very beginning. I'm like, okay, I really like this food and I really don't like that food. I like these tools and I don't like those tools. And you can go down the list, and it should be quite a bit easier, in fact, to actually prep, because you don't have to account other people's likes and dislikes and all that stuff that what I'm talking about. If you have a family, you know that you have to compromise constantly, not only to keep the peace, but to allow other people to be themselves. So it can be a bit, of a puzzle. So that's important. Also, to know your limitations. You don't want to overdo things to the point that gets you in trouble. Just like you don't want to also be too sedentary and not do enough and then have regrets. So be a good steward of your time, but don't go to the point of overdoing things that you normally do because it doesn't actually become helpful. Learn how to live with your decisions and become clear on making those choices that reflect on your morals and values. And this is something that's really big for me because you have to live with yourself. You can't just make decisions or just randomly and expect that they're all going to just be perfect. You actually have to think them through, have some level of planning, actually understand why you're doing what you're doing, have some intention, have purpose, and those will help you. And you may want to throw a little bit of prayer in there, or whatever your religious or spiritual beliefs, you may want to invoke them for clarity. And this is going to give you a lot better odds, a lot better means of getting to where you want to be, and not just be at the mercy of random chance. So these are my biggest concerns for the single prepper. We could also mix in the lone wolf, even though the lone wolf is by definition very different than just an average person that happens to be single and happens to be a prepper and live, obviously by themselves. I would have to say that a lone wolf is very much someone that actually purposely isolates themselves. And not all single people do that by any means. In fact, the great majority, if not almost all, single people typically have some type of social outlet and they want to be included in a group because guess what? We're social creatures. So going back to the biggest concerns, though, for single preppers, the first is a medical emergency, medical injury. Maybe you need to be rescued. Maybe you get so weak you can't care for yourself. That's a concern. That is a big concern. So that's something to consider, why you would want to have at least some type of relations with local people in your area. Maybe just, even if it's just your neighbor, have some type of relationship that someone can at least check in. If they haven't heard from you or seen from you for a few days, they can at least check in and just, even if that's all it is, it's just saying, hey, you still alive? That right there could be a massive blessing in a lot of ways. Now, you may say, well, if they can call you and you can actually answer the phone, then why couldn't you call out for help if you needed help? And so there's a lot of those kind of debates. So it may not just be on the phone. It may be to knock on their door every once in a while and just say, hey, I don't mean to bug you. Just haven't seen you outside for a couple of days. Are you doing all right? And that's okay if they say, just checking. And if you say, yeah, doing good, and they head on out, that's all that we're talking about here. Personal protection is the next one. And home defense. When you're by yourself, it's really hard to overcome multiple attackers and to defend a home that's, even if it's a smaller home, if there's like many different entrance ways and larger windows, a lot of access points, man, it's going to be difficult to actually keep people out of your home. Let's just be honest. And so, you're going to have a plan on how to possibly probably egress and get out of there. Because, if there's more than like 2 or 3 people and they're attacking the home from different angles, it's going to be real hard to deal with that. It's just going to be logical, So you're going to have a plan to deal with that for sure. The next is how to deal with that cocktail of loneliness, despair, and vulnerability that people sometimes feel from the outside looking in, if you will, when you're a single person. Sometimes you just feel like the whole world's against you, when it's really not. But there's these emotions and feelings you get sometimes when you're down in the dumps. So you have to figure out ways to get out of that. And that's so, where you can pull on your spirituality, you can pull on your hobbies, you can pull on friends and family, maybe a neighbor. Whatever you have, you can pull on them as resources. That's sometimes why they're there. And so you don't need to suffer needlessly. And of course, it just reinforces the fact of why we need a support network. The next is the fear of being rejected from that particular support group, whatever it may be, whatever it may be for you. It could be something like a club or maybe even a friend, that you've known for a long time. It's not like completely unheard of for people just to come up to you and say, hey, I just don't think it's working anymore. I don't really want to hang out with you, that happens from time to time. So that's why it's good to have multiple resources in terms of social connections. You don't want to have all your time in 1 or 2 people, because that 1 or 2 people could reject you. They could die, a lot of things. And even though that sounds selfish, we're not talking about that. We're just talking about having good mental and spiritual health here. So when we're talking about having a diversity of different social contacts, I personally would try to pick from a lot of different parts of society. I wouldn't just do everybody that I've met at church or everybody I met that are friends of the family. I would have a big branch of different types of people that you can pull from. So that's a big problem, they have to deal with that rejection. And it's worse though when you have a smaller group of people to start out with, because you end up with even a smaller group of those that you can go for help. The next is what happens if you have damage to your primary shelter, like your home, or maybe your vehicle, like your car or your truck, and you can't get around. So not having your shelter that is efficient and not having the means to be mobile, those are major problems for an individual prepper, because they don't have maybe a second car. They don't have a spouse that they can say, hey, can you take me up to get groceries or drop me off at work, or hey, we can pull our monies together and get that roof fixed. Sometimes the single person has some big challenges. And so it's a little harder to take care of resources if you're the sole breadwinner. And this goes into the lack of resources to get things in a crisis, especially if you're like me, it probably would be one of the most difficult things to get aid in a real crisis. Let's say the community has been damaged by extreme events, maybe a natural disaster, and I go to a government organization, for example, and try to get help. If there's women and children in need and families in need, and here I am, a white, middle-aged male that looks pretty healthy and robust, and I go in there asking for help, I would really imagine on some level that they would say that you're probably the last on the priority, just because of how society is. And it's not that I wouldn't need help, it's just that maybe in their minds, other people would need it before you. So that's just a reality. And I have actually seen that personally in my life. People of my age and my gender and my race be completely excluded from any type of social help. Now, I have never actually went to actually ask for help from any kind of government. I'm always the one that's paying in taxes. But I have known people in a very temporary manner. They were just caught in between jobs or had some crisis in their life, and they just needed just a little bit of help for just a small amount of time, maybe just for a few weeks. That's all they're talking about. And they go for help from a local, state, or even federal government level, and they get denied. When there's other people all around them of different backgrounds and different ages, they get accepted. And so you can never really figure out if you're going to get help or not. That's why I don't ever rely on a government to be my backup system or to even be any help because I've seen it actually been denied to those people who've actually paid in their taxes. But when it comes to actually ask for a little help, they get denied. So government really isn't there to help everyone. Okay, so the next thing would be the loss of a job, as we talked about just a moment ago in some way. If you're the sole breadwinner, then you have a lot of burden on you to actually to produce. And when you stop producing, you can't pay bills, you could go homeless, you could start starving. You could have a lot of problems, pretty quickly. Especially if you look at the stats, most people almost have no savings, no backup funds, almost no emergency fund. And it wouldn't take for a lot of people a few weeks to a month or two, and they would be completely wiped out financially. And that's about how a lot of Americans live, paycheck to paycheck. And the last thing I want to say is the loss of confidence. Individual people, sometimes when they get into a little bit more of a despair, they lose their confidence and they have a lot of self-doubt that can lead to depression. And so that we have to always be mindful of that slippery slope. Not a lot of us had that problem, at least that I know of, but it has happened in the past. That I've talked to people and they're like, yeah, I'm by myself, and it just gets, it probably has to do with loneliness, I would imagine, or their way of looking at being alone. And instead of trying to embrace the loneliness and saying, okay, and make it into a solitude moment of enjoyment and freedom, they question themselves, that they're not good enough or something, and that there must be something wrong with them because they're by themselves. And so we don't need to be so hard on ourselves. It actually provides no benefit to beat ourselves up. And so these are some things that I think about for the single prepper. Stay tuned, though, for the next edition, which will be the young prepper.